there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 6, and just a little catch up on what's been going on the last couple issues. Swamp Thing has finally made it back to America after he was in the Balkans and Scotland. And unfortunately, on his way back to America, he took a ship. They discovered that he was a swamp monster, and they tried to attack him. He jumped in the water, and he ended up coming ashore in Maine. And there he met a brother and sister who were under attack from some townsfolk that thought they were witches. So Swamp Thing tried to protect them from these townspeople, but he is not successful in that endeavor, and he ends up getting pushed back in the ocean with his arm cut off. And the girl is put on trial in front of everybody in the town. She was found guilty during that trial, and as they were burning her at the stake, Swamp Thing was able to pull himself out of the water and save her. Then it turned out that she was actually a conduit for a witch, and that witch was her brother. So her brother took over her body and used magic in order to turn the rest of the townsfolk that were attacking them into flowers. And that's where we left off in the last issue, Swamp Thing walking away from a town that has been massacred by a witch. And not necessarily undeservedly, but, for sure, a bunch of people in that town were dead. And on the very last page of last issue, we cut to an epilogue of two people sitting on a porch, and it turns out that these two people were Alec and Linda Holland, which is impossible because Alec is Swamp Thing and Linda is dead. So we'll have to find out what's going on with that in this issue. So first things first, with issue 6, we got the cover here. We see Swamp Thing is battling some sort of robotic monster. And this robot's got kind of a cool design. The top of his head is clear so you can kind of see whatever brain mechanism is running it. And the robot has an interesting face for a robot because it's basically a bird's face. There's a beak, but there's nothing else on it that's bird-like, so that's kind of interesting. And then one of his arms has like a battering ram, and the other one has just a 4-fingered claw. And it looks like Swamp Thing is doing pretty well in this fight because he has thrown the robot into a bunch of clocks, I guess, that are in this room. And as we turn to the first page, we see the name of this comic is A Clockwork Horror, and it is written by Len Wein with art by Bernie Wrightson. And we get a splash page of Matt Cable's desk where we see all these different files and pieces of evidence that he's gathered in his quest to capture Swamp Thing. And there's a narration at the top that says, "Witness, the desktop of a man bewildered, spread haphazardly with the usual clippings and files that are the fabric of an investigator's work. But these particular papers are more than work, much more. They are, in fact, the pieces of a most perplexing puzzle, a mystery that has haunted Matt Cable across the face of the earth. Go ahead, then. Study these scant bits of information, but study them with care, for they may well be the fragments of one man's soul." So if we study Matt Cable's desk like the narrator said, we see there's a bunch of stuff about Ferret and Alec Holland being dead, but we also get some Easter eggs. We see a note that says Matt called Joe Orlando, and Joe Orlando is the editor of this comic. And then also we see that Matt Cable's holding an artist conception of Swamp Thing, and it looks exactly like the Swamp Thing that is drawn in this comic book. And we see that's because it's actually drawn by Bernie Wrightson, so there's like a fourth wall break in this comic on the first page. And there's a note that goes along with the drawing, and it says, "Artist conception. Refer to the specifics on the attached data sheet. Matt, this is the best I could do with the description you gave me. Bernie. P.S. Call me if you need revisions." So that's a pretty fun little Easter egg. So as we turn the page, we see that Abigail is standing over Matt Cable's desk, and Matt Cable is saying to her, "Blast. The answer is in these papers somewhere, Abigail. I know it is. What I don't know is how in hell to find it." And Abigail reassures him, "Don't underestimate yourself, Matt. You're the best investigator the government has. If anyone can solve the riddle of that Swamp Thing, you." But she's interrupted as someone comes into Matt Cable's office and says, "Excuse me, folks. I hope I'm not interrupting anything." We see an older, balding white man come through the door, and he's got a file for Matt Cable. And Matt sees him and says, "Hey, Jack, come on in and pull up a chair." And Matt replies, "I better not, Matt, because in 6 seconds you may not want to even look at me." And then he walks over to Matt and hands Matt the file and says, "It's bad news, Matt. They're taking you off that Holland Swamp Thing assignment because you're too personally involved, they say. They got something new for you. Some strange little town in Vermont they want checked out." So Jack hands Matt the file, and then he leaves and says, "I'm sorry, Matt. I know how you felt about the Holland couple, but there's nothing to be done." And as Jack leaves, Matt Cable gets pretty mad, and he bangs his fist down on his desk and he says, "Involved? They're damn right I'm involved. That inhuman monster murdered my best friends. And assignment or no assignment, I'm not going to quit until I find it and make it pay. Then we cut to a road in the middle of somewhere, we don't know, and there is a truck driving on it, and on the asphalt in front of that truck, we see there is a big pothole, and the narration says, "Observe, a twisting two-lane roadway in the mountains of Vermont. A vegetable truck owned by one Guido Rosselli, itinerant farmer. An unrepaired pothole over which said vegetable truck jounces." And we see the wheel of that truck strike the pothole, and then something falls out of the back of the truck. And at first it just seems like it's a couple boxes of vegetables, but we also see a different type of plant life. The Swamp Thing himself falls out of the back of the truck, and the narration continues. "And a moss-encrusted mockery of a man who had a chance to steal a ride in the rear of the aforementioned vehicle, and in so doing learns that there ain't no such thing as a free ride." So Swamp Thing doesn't just fall out of the back of that truck, he continues to roll, and unfortunately this truck was on a road that runs along the side of a cliff, so Swamp Thing rolls off the cliff and rolls down the side of it until he smacks into the ground. And as he does, he thinks to himself, "Ugh, what happened? Feels like I was put through a cement mixer. Fall knocked everything out of me. Haven't the strength to..." And then we see a boot appear in front of him, and he thinks, "Huh? A boot? A girl's boot." And as he looks up at the person wearing the boot, we see it is in fact the woman from the last issue that looks a lot like Linda Holland. And she looks out at Swamp Thing and says, "Hi, need any help?" And I think that's a pretty weird reaction for someone to have when they find a swamp monster on the ground. It's just super casual. And as Swamp Thing looks up at her, he thinks, "No, it can't be." Because like I said, this looks like his late wife, Linda Holland. And then Swamp Thing passes out from the fall. So then we cut to Matt Cable and Abigail and the dog, who are driving to Vermont to look into the new case that Matt Cable was given. And the narration says that they are about 50 miles back along the same roadway that Swamp Thing just fell off of. And Abigail is talking to Matt in the car, and she's saying, "I'm so glad you finally came to your senses, Matt. You really do need a break from that Swamp Thing case to help clear your thinking on it." And Matt replies, "Look, Abigail, I'm only here because I'm a professional. And because the sooner I'm finished with this assignment, the sooner I can get back to that monster. Situation understood?" And Abigail says to Matt, "Please, Matt, give yourself a chance. This sounds like such an interesting case." And Matt Cable replies, "Does it, Abigail? What's so interesting about a deserted mining town springing back to life? If it wasn't for the fact that none of the town's new residents has ever registered with the government or paid any taxes, we'd have never even heard of it." Then we cut to the office of Mr. E, who has been the bad guy in the background. He is the leader of the conclave, and he has been listening to all the conversations with Matt Cable and Abigail through way of a radio transmitter that he has put on their dog. So as he listens to what Matt Cable just said, he says to himself out loud in the room, "Were it not for the secret transmitter implanted on the skull of your canine pet, I wouldn't have heard it either, Mr. Cable." And then he walks over to his ape-like pet and he begins to pet it, and he says, "A ton of anonymous people, huh? It will indeed prove interesting to discover the reasons behind it. Perhaps there may even be a way for the Conclave and I to profit from it." Then we cut to a grassy meadow where Swamp Thing has apparently been moved to, and Swamp Thing is beginning to regain consciousness, and as he sits up, he sees two people, a man and a woman. The woman is Linda that we saw before, but the man is another guy we've seen before. It looks exactly like Alec Holland, and the man says, "Hey fella, glad you're awake. You had us worried there for a minute. My name's Alec Holland, and this is my wife, Linda." And as Swamp Thing sees them, he thinks, "No, this is a nightmare. Linda is dead, and I was Alec Holland." And then Linda walks over to him and says, "Come on, fella. Cat got your tongue? We told you our names. What's yours?" And Swamp Thing just stares at her dumbstruck, and he thinks, "I must be delirious, imagining things." And then Linda tries to help him sit up even more, saying, "Oh, you poor thing. You can't speak, can you? You were hurt in the fall." And Swamp Thing thinks, "Fall? Yes, that's it. I'm still unconscious, dreaming all this." And then Linda gets under his arm and helps him to his feet, and she says, "Here, let me help you up." And it looks like Swamp Thing's pretty wobbly still as he stands, and he thinks to himself, "Now little Linda is lifting me off the ground, and I weigh over 500 pounds. I've got to snap out of this." And then he kind of moves away from Linda and he thinks to himself, "Go away, both of you. You're only figments of a fevered mind." And he's showing concern on his face, and Linda sees this and says, "Oh, you poor dear. You're confused, aren't you? Come on, we'll take you into town to meet the mayor. He'll explain everything to you. He's good at that." So Swamp Thing decides to go along, and he takes each one by the hand, and they begin to walk towards the town. And Swamp Thing thinks, "Sure, why not? Take me to your mayor. At this point, I'd believe just about anything." So Swamp Thing walks into this town with them, and we see there's not really a lot of people or anything in this town, but it does look pretty quaint. All the houses look very old school European, and the narration says, "If the Swamp Thing felt he was dreaming before, how can he possibly explain the sight that looms before him at the verdant forest's edge? For were he to believe the evidence of his moss-encumbered eyes, he would have to say that he stands before a small Swiss village, which is impossible, isn't it?" So Swamp Thing, Linda, and Alec finally reach the mayor's house, and Linda says to Swamp Thing, "Here we are, fella. You'll love Mayor Clockman. Everybody does." So they walk into the mayor's office or residence, and the narration says, "On carved brass hinges, the front door swings open, and the mossy man-brute is thrust into a strange cacophony of all too familiar noises, the precision sounds of ticking." So we see Swamp Thing enter the room, and the room is full of clocks, lots of different types, but they all look like the old school style that are made of wood with very fancy and ornate designs. And in the back of this room, we see an older white gentleman who's a little portly, and he is wearing lederhosen, which is definitely an interesting look. And when he sees Swamp Thing and Linda, he says, "Welcome, mine friend. Come in, come in." And I will say this guy looks a lot like Belle's dad from the Beauty and the Beast animated movie, except he's wearing lederhosen, which once again is an interesting choice. And as Swamp Thing sees the man, the narration says, "And that is when the Swamp Thing becomes aware he is dreaming no longer, if he ever truly was." So Mayor Clockman walks towards Swamp Thing and he begins to talk to him saying, "I trust Herr Alec and Frau Linda have shown you through our little village. We are all quite proud of it, you know. Though I perhaps am prouder than the rest. I designed this town, you see, built most of it with mine own two hands. But as usual, I forget mine manners. I talk, and I do not even introduce myself. I am Hans Clockman, carpenter, watchmaker, and lately mayor of Burgess Town, at your most willing service." And then he does a very strange thing. The mayor walks over to a table that has bottles of milk and a big stack of cookies just waiting there, and he says to Swamp Thing, "You would care perhaps for some cookies and a glass of milk?" And Swamp Thing just stares at him and he says, "No, I suppose not. I can see from your eyes you desire no refreshments, only answers. Then answers you shall have, mine strange silent friend. Make yourself comfortable, if that is possible, and I will tell you everything you want to." But before Mayor Clockman can finish, all of a sudden a couple of his clocks begin ringing, and it looks like Swamp Thing is pretty startled by these alarms. And then the clockman gets out his pocket watch and checks the time and says, "Ah, look at the time. Forgive me, mine friend, but I am afraid mine tale must wait. As mayor, there are certain duties I must perform." Then we see the mayor put on a large red top hat and a large green suit jacket over his lederhosen. And he continues, "The villagers will expect me in the town square momentarily, and I must not disappoint them. They are all like such children, and they should not be kept waiting. But please, mine friend, join me." And as we turn the page, we cut to the mayor standing on a podium in the middle of the town square, and he's waving to them, and the narration says, "Most of the townsfolk have already arrived, when the Swamp Thing and his cherubic host at last mount the stairs to the hand-carved platform. There, the mossy brute stands silently, his dark hooded eyes curiously studying the exultant multitude gathered before him, and he cannot remember when he last saw so many people so simply, outrageously happy. But still, something nags at the back of the man-monster's mind, an uncomfortable, almost undefinable feeling. Then we see as the mayor is waving to the townsfolk, he's saying, "Hello, mine friends. Everything is fine. I'm still here." And as Swamp Thing looks at the crowd of villagers, he kind of recognizes some of their faces, and the narration says, "Are the Swamp Thing's senses still affected by his fall? Or are most of the faces in this crowd really that familiar to him?" And then the mayor turns to the Swamp Thing and says, "Wonderful people, are they not, mine friend? smiling, carefree, totally unable to feel jealousy, greed, hatred, or any of the other billion other sins the soul of man is heir to. And then he sees the look on Swamp Thing's face as he stares into the crowd and says, "Ha! You stare at me in disbelief, but I assure you, my friend, I know what I say. After all, who could know the citizens of Burgess better than the fat man who built them?" And then we get a panel of him looking kind of sinister because it's an upshot of him and his face is covered in shadow, and he says, "Come, it is time for me to continue my interrupted tale." So Swamp Thing and the mayor leave the stage, and behind them we see that Linda and Alec are following them, and the mayor continues telling his tale, saying, "In Switzerland, I was an artisan, a maker of clockwork toys. But when the Second Great War began, I fled my homeland in fear and came to America, where I stumbled upon this deserted mining town and knew I'd found what I was searching for." Then we see the mayor take him to a board in his office where he has a bunch of clippings of obituaries, and one of the obituaries says, "Scientist, the victim of sabotage, the Doctor's Holland." And as they walk up to this board, the mayor says, "I reconstructed the ruins in the style of mine homeland, then built the Clockwork people to bring the town to life. Why I gave mine creations faces from the newspaper obituary columns, I do not know, except perhaps to offer those poor unfortunates a second chance." Then as they continue walking past the clocks and that board, we see there's a large second half of this workshop that is dedicated to the making and assembly of robots. And these robots have like human skins on them, so they're made to look like humans. And the mayor continues, "Perhaps to offer the world a second chance as well. For when I designed my robotic marvels, conceived in their intricate mechanical minds, I eliminated all of mankind's baser traits. My people know only love, friendship, trust, compassion. They are incapable of raising their hands against their neighbor. Who knows? Maybe with luck, the rest of the world will learn from them. But enough of such maudlin matters." And then Mayor Clockman turns to Alec and Linda the robots, and he says, "Linda, I'm certain our guest would enjoy a tour of the surrounding countryside. Your husband and I have things to attend to here." And then Linda begins to go over to Swamp Thing and kind of direct him away from Mayor Clockman and Alec, and she says, "Okay, Mayor Clockman, I'll give the tall, dark, and silent here a lesson in forestry he'll never forget." So Swamp Thing takes her hand and they begin to walk out towards the forest. And Swamp Thing definitely takes note that Linda is holding his hand, and the narration says, "An almost forgotten sensation ripples along the Swamp Thing's spine as he wraps his misshapen, moss-encrusted hand around Linda's far more delicate fingers. Then smiling, the two stroll casually away to discover the nearby forest, never knowing how narrowly they have missed an encounter with an old and determined friend." And as the narration says this, in the panel underneath, we see Matt Cable's car is pulling up into the town. And they have parked right in front of a factory, and as Matt and Abby get out of the car, Matt says, "It sounds like people working inside, Abigail. Come on, maybe someone here can tell us where to find the head man in this Looney Tunes town." And just as they're about to enter the factory, Mayor Clockman comes out to greet them and says, "Welcome, my friends. Come in, come in. I'm Mayor Clockman." And Matt is kind of thrown off by his appearance because the mayor looks pretty goofy in his lederhosen top hat and suit jacket. And Matt says to him, "In that case, pal, I've got some questions for you." Then we cut to another laboratory where Mr. E is sitting in front of a computer desk, and he's once again talking to his ape creature. And the narration says over this panel, "And when Matt Cable's many questions have been answered, and the tale retold for the second time this day." Oh, and I should also say that the dog is with Matt Cable when they get out of the car and talk to the mayor. So Mr. E has also overheard this whole story about the robots and stuff, and he says to his ape creature, "A town full of mechanical men who move and speak exactly like humans, and an old man capable of creating more? This is a find indeed, and something to be dealt with promptly." Then he gets on the radio and says, "Task Force 4, immediate scramble. I have the most important job for you." Then we get to Linda and Swamp Thing, and they're on top of a mountain ridge, and they're overlooking the town from far above. And Linda is saying, "Beautiful, isn't it? The mayor calls this land God's country. But if that's true, I can't imagine why God would ever want to part with it. Still, I'm glad that he did, very glad. What a shame it would be to have lived without ever seeing something like this. It's simply..." Then she's cut off because it begins to rain, and she says, "Hey, what did I say? It started raining. And then the Swamp Thing just stares up at the rain. She grabs his hand and begins to pull him to run and says, well, don't just stand there, silly. Hunt cover. Do you want to rust? And as she says this, Swamp Thing thinks to himself, rust. What an apt choice of words. So they run under a tree to hide from the rain, and as they sit down underneath it, Swamp Thing and her are kind of positioned in an intimate way. Her back is against the tree, and he's supporting himself with the tree just above her with his arm, and he's kind of leaning towards her. And she says to him, there, all safe and sound. Now what would you like to talk about? And as Swamp Thing stares at her, he thinks, talk? If only I could. She's just a robot, I know that. But she looks so much like Linda, acts so much like her, that I want to take her into my arms and Swamp Thing actually begins to wrap his arms around her, and he moves his head in for a kiss. And she looks like she's kind of into it because she's putting her hand up to his face. But then Swamp Thing freaks out and yells, no! And then he thinks, by all that is holy, what am I doing? She's a robot, only a robot, with programmed emotions. How could I expect even a machine to respond to a what? In God's name, what am I? And while he was thinking this, he stood up and he walked away from her back out into the rain, and we can see her running after him. Then we come back to Matt, Cable, and Abby, who are inside the Clockman's workshop, and we see Abby is actually sitting at the table drinking a glass of milk, so she is obviously taking the mayor's offer up on cookies and milk. And Matt Cable is just staring out through the window looking at the rain, and Abby turns to him and says, wow, listen to that rain. It sounds like the storm is getting worse. And Matt replies, I'd agree, except for one thing, Abigail. It stopped raining. No, something else is howling up that racket out there, and I think I'd better find out what it is. So he moves to go outside with Abigail following him, and we also see the mayor is looking up in confusion as well. And as they go outside, they see that the noise is being caused by a helicopter. And this is no normal helicopter. This is a gigantic, bright yellow, round helicopter. So as they come outside, Abby sees it and says, a helicopter! And Matt says, but like no chopper I've ever seen. And as the helicopter lands, we see it is pretty gigantic, because when the door opens, 4 henchmen and a robot that's twice the size of them come out of it. And these henchmen are dressed awesome. They are all wearing skin-tight red spandex suits that cover their entire body except for their face. They kind of look like they should be in a Devo cover band. So as they all exit the helicopter, they all have guns except for the robot, and we can actually hear Mr. E through a speaker on the robot giving orders to his henchmen. And he's saying, Task Force 4, deploy yourselves in the pre-designated pattern. Complete control of immediate area must be effected at once. So Mayor Clockman, being a nice guy, just walks up to the robot and these henchmen that are brandishing weapons and says, welcome, my friends. I am Hans Clockman, the mayor. Is there some way I can be of service to you? And then the robot turns to him and says, Clockman, yes. You can be of great service to us, and you alone. I represent an organization known as the Conclave, and we desire exclusive control of you and your mechanical creations. And the mayor, who seems pretty dense, still walks up to the robot and says, you what? But that is impossible, quite impossible. And the robot replies, nothing is impossible, Mr. Clockman, as you will soon learn. As you can see, the Conclave has had some small success in the field of robotics, nothing close to your own, of course, and we intend to use your knowledge one way or... But the robot is cut off by Matt Cable coming forward and standing between the mayor and the robot with a gun. And he points his revolver at the robot and says, over my dead body, you will. And one of the henchmen immediately raises his gun and points it at Matt Cable. And the robot says to Matt, that can be most easily arranged, you impulsive idiot, if you dare to attempt anything so foolish again. And then the henchman shoots at Matt Cable, but I guess he's a really good aim with that Thompson machine gun because he pulls the trigger, multiple shots come out, and they all hit Matt directly in the same spot in his right arm. And this causes him to drop his revolver, and he grabs his arm and he kind of stumbles, and Abigail runs up behind him saying, Matt, your arm! And the robot says to her, please, Miss Arcane, you need not concern yourself over such a minor flesh wound. Matt Cable has suffered much worse in his time, I assure you. And then Matt looks up at the robot, kind of astonished that the robot, or whoever's talking through him, knows so much about Matt's history, and also he knows Abigail's name. And the robot sees this astonishment on Matt's face, and he says, Come now, Mr. Cable. You needn't look so astonished. I've kept a close watch on you for several months now. Indeed, I know all about your hunt for the creature called the Swamp Thing. Yes, Matthew, you've been most valuable to us of late, but I'm afraid that value has come to an end. And Matt Cable yells up at the robot, I don't know what you're talking about, Tin Man, but that last comment doesn't exactly break my heart. And then the henchmen begin to take Abby and Matt and put them in the helicopter as prisoners. And as Matt and Abby are pushed onto the helicopter, the robot continues. There is much we wish to know about the operation of your security organization, but I am quite certain that all such information must be gleaned from you by force, and those activities can be best conducted in our home office. Goodbye, Mr. Cable. I will rejoin you when I've concluded my business here. And then the robot turns his attention to Mayor Clockman and all the people in the town square that are just standing there looking at them. And the mayor actually yells at the robot saying, But you have no business here, you vile monster. Even if you kill me, I would never work for such as you. And the robot replies, Kill you, Mayor Clockman. We would never dream of such a thing. And then the henchmen step forward and point their Thompson submachine guns at the crowd of people. And as they open fire on the crowd, we see the Alec Holland robot is the first one to be destroyed, and the robot continues talking to the Clockman, saying, But your mechanical constituents are another thing entirely. And as Mayor Clockman watches the Alec Holland robot get shot up and blown apart, he yells out, No! And then we get a panel of the robot that is Linda Holland, and she looks on horrified at this scene as well, and the narration says, And from the edge of a nearby clearing, the cry is echoed in tones far from mechanical. And the Linda robot yells out, Alec! Oh no! No! And all of the robots and Clockman are just staring at the destroyed body of the robot Alec Holland, and the narration says, Anguished, the girl races forward, startling a jumpsuited gunman. So the Linda robot lunges towards the Alec robot, yelling, Please no! I love him! I love... But her cries are cut short as she is then fired upon by the same henchman, and we see her chest and back explode from the bullets ripping through her body. And these are full robot people, just so you know, so it's not super bloody or anything, it's just robot parts and mechanical things bursting out from her torso. And I forgot to mention, kind of because it came out of nowhere, but Linda and Swamp Thing were on their hike, then they came back to town and saw this scene, and then she ran out when Alec got shot. So Swamp Thing is there too, and he watches as Linda just explodes in front of him, and he thinks, Linda, God, no, not again. And then he runs forward and catches her body as it falls down, and he cradles her as he thinks, There's nothing I can do for her now. And as he's holding her, she's just repeating, Love him, love him, love him, love him, love him, love him. And as that repeat is happening and getting dimmer and dimmer each time, Swamp Thing is looking more and more sad and more distraught, and he's thinking, Oh, Linda, have I found you only to lose you for a second time? No, Linda, it's me you love, the me I used to be. Please, Linda, stop that. It's me you love. Stop it, Linda. You don't love him. You don't. Stop it, Linda. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. And as she goes silent, he smashes his fist in anger into her chest, but she is completely gone by then. But now Swamp Thing is super pissed, so he stands up and runs towards the henchmen and begins beating the crap out of them. And the narration says, His hysterical fury spent, the mossy man-brute stares shamefully for a moment at the shattered image of the woman he loved. Then, the rage that wells within him can scarcely be contained. And as Swamp Thing knocks the first couple of henchmen aside, he thinks to himself, Out of my way, you scum, or you'll get just a taste of what I planned for your master. And the robot sees Swamp Thing running towards him, and he says, So, a little company is complete. At long last, the Swamp Thing enters the scene. Then the robot and Swamp Thing square off, and I think they've said it before, but Swamp Thing is like 8 or 9 feet tall, and the robot is towering over him. So I'd say he's maybe like 15 feet tall. But that puts Swamp Thing face directly in front of the robot's right arm, which is in the shape of a battering ram. And the robot continues speaking to Swamp Thing, saying, Yes, monster, we know of you. In fact, we've hunted you for quite some time now. Thank you very much for bringing our search to an end. And then the ram shoots out and hits Swamp Thing right in the face, and it actually knocks Swamp Thing down. And then the robot points at Swamp Thing on the ground and says, I'm certain our people in Gotham can gain easily as much from you as they can from Matt Cable. And then Swamp Thing, who didn't see Matt Cable get captured and put on the helicopter, thinks, Cable, they have him too? And as he's thinking this, the robot leans down to get closer to his face, kind of taunting Swamp Thing, and he says, now, just sit there quietly until we are ready to leave, and my mighty hydraulic arm will not be put to use again. And Swamp Thing ain't having that. He's not taking orders from this robot, and he thinks to himself, sit here quietly after what you've done? No, robot, you must be joking. So now that the robot is within punching distance, Swamp Thing takes his fist and smashes it into the robot's face. And it literally does nothing except make the robot mad, or the person controlling the robot mad. So in retaliation, the robot stands up and uses his non-ram hand, and he punches Swamp Thing in the face, which knocks Swamp Thing back on the ground again, and he says, misshapen fool, this body is forged from the strongest titanium steel. How could you even think to damage it? And as Swamp Thing looks up from the ground, the robot says, I do not give warning lightly, monster. You've disobeyed me once, but you will not live to attempt it again. Then the robot's hydraulic arm begins pumping, and he says, when my awesome hydraulic arm strikes you this time, it will not be to stun, but to crush. And then he moves to strike Swamp Thing with his hydraulic arm, but Swamp Thing is able to slightly move aside, and the arm just misses him, but it actually enables Swamp Thing to catch the arm like it's a football. And as he does this, Swamp Thing thinks, no chance, Tin Man. You don't catch me off guard twice. And then he begins to pull with all his might on the arm, and the hydraulic fittings and hoses begin to snap and stretch, and Swamp Thing thinks, so you can take this much vaunted hydraulic arm of yours and stick it in your mechanical ear. And he rips the arm off, and then he takes the ram, and he uses it to bash the head of the robot in. And as he does this, the robot yells out, no, stop! What do you do? And the smashing of the head with the robot's own arm seems to do the trick, because the robot falls to the ground. So everybody's looking at this fight scene, including the henchmen who are just standing around, and now they have their guns pointed at Swamp Thing, but they're obviously a little scared because Swamp Thing just killed the robot. So one of them says, what do we do now, Pete? Should we take him? And Pete the henchman replies, are you crazy? You saw what that monster did to the boss's robot. Do you want him to do the same to us? And as the henchmen just stand there and gawk at the scene, the robot begins to talk again, and it says, you spineless fools! The Swamp Thing's wrath will be nothing compared to the Conclave's vengeance if you disobey my orders. And then as he gives his orders, the speaker on the robot begins to give out. So the robot's final words are, destroy the monster! Fools! I command you! And with that, the speaker dies, so the robot can't talk anymore, and I'm assuming Mr. E probably can't see what's going on. And even though the message was a little bit garbled at the end, the henchmen understand what he was telling them. So they raise their guns at Swamp Thing, and one of them yells, you heard the man, fellas. Gun him now! And just as it looks like they're about to fire on Swamp Thing, the clockman runs out of nowhere and runs in between Swamp Thing and the gunman, yelling, no, I beg of you, do not do this thing. There has been enough violence here today. Do not make a mockery of all that I have lived. But he isn't able to finish his sentence because the henchmen open fire and they shoot him right in the stomach. And Swamp Thing, of course, is taken aback by this because he likes the clockman. The clockman seems pretty nice to him. So as the shot Mayor Clockman falls to the ground, Swamp Thing thinks, no, Clockman stepped into the line of fire before I could move. They've killed him. And when Mayor Clockman falls to the ground, his glasses fall off, and we get this really cool panel where we see the reflection of the robotic peoples in the glasses, and they're just staring in sad disbelief that the creator has been killed. And the narration says, for a seeming eternity, silence hangs heavily upon the scene, as the stunned assemblage gazes mutely at the sprawled form of a man who is willing to die for his dream. Then the robots begin to stare up at the henchmen, and they get this very angry look on their face. And the henchmen look on in fear as these robots begin to walk towards them with their arms outstretched, and they look like they are very angry. And the narration continues. And a harsh chill ripples through the costumed gunmen as they stare up at the mechanical beings who surround them, for the expressions carved on those humanoid faces could never have been placed there by the late Hans Clockman. Then we get a quote from the late mayor saying, they are incapable of raising their hands against their neighbors. And the narration continues. Those were the little clockmaker's words, but their meaning is soon drowned out by the furious chatter of machine gun fire that echoes across the square. But it seemed that this rule that the clockman thought he had set up was not the case, because as the gunmen opened fire on the approaching robots, yes, they're hitting some of them, they're shooting pieces off of them, but it seems there are just too few bullets and too many robots, and as they overwhelm the henchmen, the narration continues. If Hans Clockman had lived to witness this atrocity, he would have surely been heartbroken. Perhaps he would have cried. But then, if the jovial mayor of Burgess had lived, this spectacle would never have come to pass. For the ring of torn and twisted mechanical bodies that presses inexorably in upon the four terrified henchmen is a circle born of the burning need for vengeance. And though that vengeance is not so much out of hatred for the gunmen as it is for the love of the old man they had slain, the result is horribly, pitiably the same. And I gotta say, we get some of the most violent, cool panels in this weird, silly issue of Swamp Thing, where the henchmen are just constantly shooting at these approaching robots, and the skin is being hit off of them. So the closer the robots get to the henchmen, they look more and more like Terminators, until there's just a pile of robots raising their fists and punching into what looks like a bloody mound of pulp. And in the end, the only thing left alive in the town is Swamp Thing. And he just apparently watched this whole scene, and he's just staring gobsmacked at what he just saw. And all that's left of this horrific scene is a little pile of blood and guts and mechanical parts that seem to be smoldering. I don't know if it's from the hatred of the robots, or maybe the robots had batteries that are bursting into flames. But Swamp Thing is just staring at this, and the narration says, "When the clamor of bullets rending metal and of metal crushing flesh at last fades into silence, there is only one solemn Swamp Thing left standing in the village square." And as Swamp Thing stands, he thinks, "Poor Clockman. In the end, his new race of men was not so terribly different from the old. What a shame." And then he walks over to a clock that's just embedded in a wall in the town, and he punches through the clock face, destroying it, I guess to symbolize what happened in this town. And then he walks away, and it just so happens that the dog that Abby and Matt brought to town is still in the town, and it did not get captured with Matt and Abby. So it joins Swamp Thing, and Swamp Thing looks at the dog and says, "Come on, Mutt. There are things we have to do before time runs out for us." So they leave the town, and then we cut to the back of a train car where Swamp Thing and the dog seem to have hitched a ride, and the narration says, 3 hours later on a slow-moving freight train. And Swamp Thing and the dog are just sitting in the freight car with the door open looking at the countryside, and there's a sign that they pass that says Gotham City, 213 miles. And it seems to be the way they're going, and Swamp Thing looks at the sign and thinks, Gotham City, that's where the Tin Man wanted to send me, and I'll wager where he sent Matt Cable too. Well, little one, if Cable is there, we're going to find him and make his captors pay. But we will have to wait to find out what happens in Gotham City, because that is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.